She spent her last $200 on a tiny cabin everyone called useless, but when they saw what she did with it, they cried. Rhoda Hogg stood in front of the decaying cabin, gripping two wrinkled $100 bills, the last of her savings. The roof was half gone, the walls split with age, and weeds climbed through the porch steps. Behind her, a few neighbors whispered that she was wasting her money. Her children had already left, upset that she'd chosen this over stability. But Rhoda's gaze stayed fixed on the broken doorway. To everyone else, it was worthless. To her, it was the one place she could finally call her own. With a deep breath, she handed the bills to the county clerk. The paper receipt trembled in her fingers as she turned toward the cabin, its silence daring her to try. No one around her believed it could stand another season. Yet soon, what she would build here would leave the whole town speechless. Would you take a risk if it meant starting over? Drop your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove it's never too late to dream again. Come with us as we take you through how it all started. For 23 years, Rhoda Hogg's life followed the same rhythm. Long shifts at the textile factory in Corbin, Kentucky, where the air smelled of cotton dust and hot oil. Her fingers moved faster than thought, feeding fabric into rattling machines that drowned out every conversation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, enough to raise 3 children and keep a modest home on the edge of town. The factory had been her second family, a place where she shared lunches, laughter, and worries with women who worked just as hard as she did. That ended the day the company shut its doors. The work went overseas, the machines went silent, and the building she had entered thousands of times became just another empty warehouse. At 58, with no savings and no degree, Rhoda was suddenly no one's employee. The severance barely covered a month's bills. Her husband, Willie, had already stopped working the year before when his lungs gave out from decades in the coal mines near Cumberland Gap. He used to joke that the mines had taken his breath long before the sickness came. But it wasn't funny when the coughing turned to choking, and every night she counted his inhaler puffs like clockwork. 6 months later, she was burying him with borrowed money and promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Medical bills came next, heavy as a mountain. Collection notices filled the mailbox faster than condolences. One morning, she came home from the grocery store to find a foreclosure notice pinned to the front door. She tried to fight it, begged the bank for more time, but her words meant nothing against debt. A month later, she stood on the courthouse steps in Whitley County, watching strangers bid on the only house she and Willie had ever owned. The furniture, the photos, the little life they built, it all vanished in less than 10 minutes. She didn't cry. She just felt hollow, like the sound had been pulled out of her chest. For 2 weeks, she slept in her 1998 pickup truck parked at a rest stop near Somerset. She kept the windows cracked just enough to breathe, her blankets folded over her knees as the spring nights dropped into the 30s. She ate peanut butter from the jar, rationing the last few groceries she could afford. Her children called daily, urging her to come to Ohio. "Mom, you can't live like this," her daughter said. Rhoda wanted to believe her, but something in her resisted. She wasn't ready to be someone else's burden. Not yet. On the 14th night, as trucks roared past and the glow from the vending machines flickered through her windshield, she scrolled through her old flip phone. She wasn't looking for anything, just trying to stay awake. That's when she saw it, a tax auction listing buried deep in a county website. A 1/4 acre on a steep hillside in Wayne County. Condemned structure, no utilities. The starting bid, $200. She stared at the number. $200. That was all she had left. Most people would have scrolled past, but Rhoda read it 3 times. It wasn't the price that caught her, it was the word structure. It meant something still stood there. Something she might save. The next morning, she drove through winding back roads toward the property, her old pickup coughing up dust. The cabin was worse than she expected. The roof had caved in, and the front steps were barely hanging on. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But as she stood there, a quiet stillness filled her. No traffic. No neighbors. Just wind through the trees and a creek murmuring nearby. It was broken, yes, but it was hers if she wanted it. No mortgage. No landlord. No one to tell her she didn't belong. At the courthouse auction later that afternoon, no one else bid. The clerk looked surprised when she raised her hand. $200 exchanged, and with a few stamps and signatures, the land was hers. As she walked out into the sunlight, the receipt in her hand felt heavier than paper. It felt like a chance. For the first time in months, she smiled, though her eyes were wet. She drove back to the hillside that evening and parked in front of the cabin. The sinking sun painted the woods in deep orange light. She stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on old gravel, and looked at the cabin again. The door hung by one hinge, the windows long gone. But the walls still stood, stubborn as she was. She whispered softly, "We're both still here." That night, she sat in her truck with the cabin's outline glowing faintly under the moon. For the first time since Willie's funeral, her chest didn't feel so tight. She didn't know what came next or how she'd make it livable. But as she watched the stars peek through the trees, one thought anchored her: she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. March came with a cold that felt like it wanted her gone. The Kentucky mountains were beautiful from a distance, but when the sun dropped, the wind cut straight through the trees and into her bones. Rhoda parked her truck near the cabin and slept inside, wrapped in 3 old blankets that barely held back the chill. Her breath fogged the windshield every morning, and she'd sit for a while, waiting for her hands to stop shaking before she tried to start the engine. The cabin wasn't fit for a raccoon, let alone a person. The roof was riddled with holes, sections of it drooping inward where rainwater had pooled and rotted the beams. Rats scurried along the rafters, and a family of birds had built a nest in one corner of what used to be the living room. Every gust of wind carried the sharp smell of decay. When she first tried to step inside, the floorboards groaned so loud she thought they might collapse under her. She backed out slowly, shaking her head. She couldn't sleep there. Not yet. The truck became her bedroom, kitchen, and shelter from the cold. She cooked on a small camp stove balanced on the tailgate, her meal simple: canned soup, crackers, coffee heated in an old tin pot. Some nights, when the temperature dropped below freezing, she'd wake up every hour to start the engine just to feel a hint of warmth from the heater. It wasn't living, but it was something. Word spread quickly through the hollow. A few locals came by out of curiosity, their faces carrying that same polite pity reserved for lost causes. Some offered advice that was really just disbelief. "You'll freeze out here, Miss Hogg," one woman said, shaking her head. "That place ain't worth fixing." Others were harsher, whispering that grief had made her lose her mind. She heard them, but didn't answer. Let them talk. She had nothing left to prove, and no one left to impress. Down the mountain road, a farmer named Clyde owned a spread of land that bordered hers. One afternoon, Rhoda knocked on his door and asked if he had any old tools she could borrow. He looked at her truck, the rust creeping up its sides, then at her weathered hands. "What are you planning to do with that shack?" he asked, half smiling, half skeptical. "Make it livable," she said simply. He laughed under his breath but went to his shed anyway, returning with a hammer, a rusted hand saw, and a bucket of nails. "Don't hurt yourself," he muttered as she drove off. He didn't expect to see her again after a week. That first week nearly broke her. Every day, she tried to clean one small section of the cabin. The smell of rot clung to her clothes. Her gloves tore as she dragged out broken furniture and splintered boards, stacking them in a pile behind the house. She discovered where rainwater was leaking through and tried to cover the worst spots with plastic sheets she'd scavenged from an abandoned shed. It helped for a few days until the wind ripped them away. But quitting wasn't an option. On the 12th day, she made her first real discovery. Driving back from town, she noticed a crew demolishing an old barn near Burnside. She waited until they were done for the day, then asked the foreman if she could take some of the leftover scraps. "Take whatever you can haul," he said, waving her off. That night, under the dim light of her truck's headlights, she began hauling tin sheets, cracked plywood, and half-rotted beams onto the bed of her truck. She made 5 trips in total, each time unloading the material and dragging it uphill, one armful at a time. Her muscles ached so badly that by the 3rd day, she could barely lift her arms. But when she looked at the growing pile beside the cabin, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: progress. She patched the roof piece by piece, hammering tin over the worst holes. It was crooked, uneven, and ugly, but it worked. She sealed the seams with pine tar she made herself from sap and ashes, boiling it down over her camp stove. The thick, smoky smell filled the air as she brushed it onto the joints. When the first rain came after that, she sat inside on an overturned bucket, listening. For the first time, the water didn't pour through. A few drips here and there, but no steady streams. She smiled, small and quiet. It wasn't much, but it meant she could finally move her bedding inside. The second victory came from something everyone had written off: the old well. Locals swore it had been dry for decades. "You're wasting your time," Clyde told her when he saw her pulling up the rotted cover. But she wasn't convinced. Over 4 days, she cleared away the trash that had been dumped inside: branches, rusted metal, and a half-broken bucket. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders. Still, she tied a rope around her waist, braced her boots, and lowered herself down inch by inch. The air grew cooler the deeper she went, the smell of earth replacing the must of the cabin. Her flashlight beam caught something glinting at the bottom: water. She reached it with trembling fingers, scooped some into an old jar she'd brought, and took a sip. It was cold, fresh, clean. She laughed so hard her echo bounced up the well walls. It felt like a small miracle. Back above ground, she built a pulley system using parts from a salvage yard in Somerset, $17 for a rusted crank and a few lengths of chain. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. When she drew her first bucket of water, she stood there for a long time, watching it ripple under the sunlight. Each day after that followed the same rhythm: work until dark, rest until dawn. The neighbors still whispered, still watched from afar, but she didn't care. The roof no longer leaked, the well was alive, and her hands, cut, blistered, and covered in tar, were proof that she could still build something from nothing. The cabin wasn't saved yet, not by a long shot. But it was standing, and so was she. By early May, the air in the Kentucky hills began to soften, but the cabin still felt more like a skeleton than a home. Rhoda woke each morning stiff from the cold, rubbing her hands together before pulling on her work gloves. The roof held now, but the walls gaped in places where time had chewed through the boards. Every breeze found its way in, whistling through cracks like it was mocking her. Still, she kept going. What she lacked in money, she made up for in grit and curiosity. If she didn't know how to fix something, she'd find out. One Saturday, she drove to London, Kentucky, to buy a few screws and nails, and that's when she found it, the Habitat Restore. It was tucked behind a strip mall, half hardware store, half miracle. The aisles were full of donated building materials, mismatched cabinets, paint cans with just enough left for a coat, and boxes of hardware sorted by hand. Rhoda wandered the aisles like she was in a dream. Doors for $3. Windows for $5. A worker stacking tiles noticed her looking at a cracked frame and smiled. "Too imperfect for most folks," he said. "But if you don't mind fixing things up, it'll do the job." Rhoda nodded. "I've been fixing things my whole life." The man introduced himself as Larry, the store manager. Over the next weeks, she became a familiar face there, always in the same denim jacket, always asking the price of something most people overlooked. Larry started setting aside items that couldn't be sold to contractors: chipped tiles, dented doors, glass panes missing corners. He knew Rhoda could make something of them. "Got another load for you, Ms. Hogg," he'd say, grinning as she backed her old truck up to the loading dock. She always paid what she could, but he often slipped her a few extras. "You're giving these things a second life," he said once. She smiled, thinking how that line fit them both. The floor came next. The cabin's old boards were warped, soft in places, and full of gaps where mice could slip through. While sipping coffee at the Monticello Public Library one morning, she overheard a man mention that a flooring company in Somerset threw away discontinued sample pieces every few months. She wrote down the name, drove there that afternoon, and asked the owner if she could take what they were tossing out. He looked surprised but agreed. Within hours, her truck was full of 6-inch squares: oak, maple, pine, laminate, even bits of stone tile, all different shapes and colors. She spent 2 weeks collecting more. The piles grew until the cabin looked like an artist's studio. On her cracked screen phone, she watched YouTube tutorials about cutting and fitting flooring, the videos buffering painfully slow over the library's weak Wi-Fi. Still, she learned. Back at the cabin, she measured each square, trimming edges with the hand saw Clyde had lent her. Piece by piece, she laid them down, gluing and pressing each tile into place. The result wasn't perfect. It was better. A patchwork of colors, grains, and textures, each one carrying its own history. When she stood back to look at it, sunlight coming through the new windows, the floor glowed like stained glass. Her next goal was light, real light. For weeks, she'd been living with candles and a kerosene lamp that smoked more than it shined. In Somerset, she found a small solar setup at a second-hand shop for $75. It was barely enough to power a single LED bulb, but it was a start. She mounted the small panel to the cabin roof and wired it herself, following instructions she printed from the library. When the bulb flickered on that night, she laughed so hard she startled the birds in the trees. It wasn't much, just a glow over her table, but to her, it felt like the world had opened up again. A few days later, while filling water at the well, she met a man passing through who noticed the panel. He was a retired Army mechanic who lived near Lake Cumberland. They talked for nearly an hour about small off-grid setups, and before leaving, he told her he had some old panels lying unused after an upgrade. "They're yours if you can haul them," he said. The next morning, she drove out to his property. He helped her load 4 panels into the bed of her truck, refusing any payment. "Someone helped me once," he said simply. Back home, Rhoda spent 2 days wiring them, careful with every connection. When she finally flipped the switch, her tiny cabin lit up brighter than ever before, enough power for a refrigerator, lights, and even a small hot plate. She cried quietly, hands covering her mouth. For the first time since losing everything, she could cook indoors and store food. It felt like a victory far larger than the space itself. With summer heat coming, she turned her attention to insulation. The cabin's walls still leaked air through every seam. Buying rolls of fiberglass was out of the question, so she searched for alternatives. At the library again, she learned that shredded denim worked as natural, non-toxic insulation. It made sense: thick, warm, durable. So she put out word through local churches, asking for old jeans. Within a week, donations poured in, boxes of denim, overalls, jackets. She spent evenings cutting and shredding them by hand with heavy scissors, humming softly to herself. Her hands cramped, her back ached, but she kept going, packing the walls tight. When she stepped back, the air inside already felt different, warmer, quieter, alive. Her final treasure came from a junkyard outside Monticello. A $30 wood stove, covered in rust, missing one leg, but otherwise solid. She scrubbed it clean, patched the leg with metal scrap, and polished it until it shone dull silver. New, it would have cost more than $1,000. She installed it herself, cutting a hole through the patched roof for the stovepipe. The first time she lit a fire inside, the smell of burning pine filled the cabin, rich and comforting. She sat beside it on an old milk crate, hands outstretched toward the heat, the flames dancing across her tired face. The walls were still rough, the ceiling still uneven, but now the cabin had light, heat, and water. It wasn't just shelter anymore, it was becoming home. Every nail, every stitch of denim, every salvaged board carried her story. She hadn't rebuilt her life overnight. She'd done it one scrap, one bruise, one breath at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Rhoda didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was living again. When the snow melted that first spring, Rhoda stood outside staring at the steep slope behind her cabin. Most people would have called it useless land. Too rocky, too uneven, too much work. But she'd spent her life making something out of whatever was left behind, and she wasn't about to stop now. The sun hit the hill for nearly 10 hours a day. That meant warmth, and warmth meant food. If she could figure out how to keep the soil from washing away, she might turn it into something alive again. Armed with nothing but a shovel, a pickaxe, and stubborn willpower, she began digging. Every day she pried loose chunks of limestone and sandstone, rolling them downhill and stacking them into low retaining walls. Slowly, the slope began to take shape, 5 terraces carved from the mountain itself, each about 3 feet wide, stretching along the contour of the hill like steps leading to the sky. Her hands blistered and bled, her back screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. When the last wall stood firm, she leaned on her shovel and looked at what she'd built. For the first time, the hillside didn't feel like an obstacle. It felt like a promise. Word spread again through the small community, and one afternoon a retired agriculture extension agent from Pulaski County stopped by out of curiosity. He'd heard about the woman who built a garden on a cliff. He arrived expecting to find a few weeds, but what he saw made him pause. He crouched to test the soil and shook his head, half smiling. "You know," he said, "you just made the best use of this land I've ever seen. You've got full southern sun here. This could work." Before leaving, he returned to his truck and came back with a small box. Inside were packets of heirloom seeds, beans, tomatoes, squash, potatoes, herbs, and greens. "These are extras from my old trials," he said. "They'll do better in soil that's been worked by hand. Just promise you'll save the seeds for next year." Rhoda thanked him with tears in her eyes. She spent the next week planting, row by row, marking each bed with hand-painted stones. The soil was thin, so she mixed in compost from fallen leaves and kitchen scraps. When she watered it from the well, the scent of damp earth filled the air, a smell that made her feel rooted again. Within weeks, green shoots began to push through. She checked them every morning, crouching low, whispering to them like they were old friends. The beans climbed, the tomatoes spread, and the squash leaves fanned out like umbrellas. The hillside that everyone said was useless was suddenly bursting with life. By late summer, her garden had grown wild and generous. The beans hung thick, the tomato vines heavy with fruit. She couldn't eat it all herself, so she started leaving baskets on her neighbors' porches, tomatoes in one, squash in another. In return, they began leaving things for her: eggs, jars of honey, milk, even a few tools. One man fixed her truck's brakes in exchange for baskets of vegetables. Another helped her cut firewood in return for potatoes. Without planning it, Rhoda had started something the community hadn't seen in years, a small circle of trade, where everyone had something to give and something to gain. The change spread quietly. Clyde, the farmer who once thought she'd never last, began stopping by every few days, always pretending he needed to borrow something but never leaving empty-handed. One evening he dropped off a bundle of cornmeal wrapped in cloth. "Got more than I can use," he said awkwardly. She handed him a jar of her pickled beans in return. Soon, others followed. Families traded what they had: fresh eggs for greens, herbs for milk. Rhoda's cabin became the unofficial meeting point, a place where people shared both goods and stories. It reminded them of older times, when survival meant helping one another instead of waiting for someone else to save them. By the time fall came, her shelves were lined with jars: tomatoes, beans, squash, pickles, herbs. She'd built a root cellar under the cabin's floor to store potatoes and onions through the winter. The land that once mocked her now provided more than she ever imagined. When she sat by her stove at night, the fire crackling softly, she often thought about Willie. He'd grown up working soil not far from here, and she liked to think he'd be proud that she'd found her way back to it. December brought the real test. The temperature dropped into single digits, and snow piled up faster than she could shovel. Within days, her truck was buried to its headlights. The power flickered out across the county, and roads closed for nearly 2 weeks. She had enough firewood and food to last, but it was the silence that got to her. Still, she wasn't truly alone. On the third day, Clyde trudged up the hill through knee-deep snow with a sack of feed for her chickens. "Just checking on you," he said, teeth chattering. She laughed and handed him a steaming mug of coffee. The next day, a family from down the road came by with a sled full of kindling. Rhoda, in turn, shared jars of soup she'd canned in late summer. What started as simple gestures became something larger. People began checking in on each other daily, forming a small web of care that stretched across the hollow. Those with extra blankets shared them. Those with working stoves shared heat. When the county roads finally cleared, no one in their area had gone hungry or frozen. Later, someone joked that Rhoda's little cabin had sparked a mountain chain reaction. She just smiled. All she'd done was try to survive, but survival, it seemed, had reminded everyone else how to live together again. When spring returned, the garden sprouted anew, stronger than before. The terraces stood firm, holding back the earth she'd carved with her own hands. Every plant, every wall, every neighbor who stopped by was proof of what she'd built. Not just a home, but a place where hope had taken root. The woman who spent her last $200 on a condemned cabin had turned that useless hillside into something no one could measure in money, a living reminder that even broken ground can bloom again. By October of the following year, the Kentucky mountains had turned gold and crimson. The air carried the scent of hickory smoke and damp earth. From a distance, Rhoda's cabin no longer looked like the wreck it once was. It blended naturally into the hillside, sturdy and lived in. The tin roof she patched by hand glinted under the afternoon sun. Word of her transformation had quietly spread through the valleys, carried by neighbors, churchgoers, and visitors who traded with her over the months. One cold morning, a man in a faded denim jacket pulled up in an old Jeep. He introduced himself as a photographer documenting rural Appalachian life. He was working on a project about resilience in forgotten communities. He'd heard stories of a woman who'd rebuilt her world with scrap wood and determination. "I'd love to take a few photos of what you've built," he said, almost hesitant, as though he didn't want to intrude. Rhoda didn't think much of it, but agreed. "Long as you don't mind getting your shoes muddy," she told him. He spent the afternoon walking the property, snapping pictures of her garden terraces, the patchwork floor inside the cabin, and the solar panels angled toward the sun. When he asked about her story, Rhoda shrugged. "Nothing fancy. I just didn't want to freeze." But when he showed her the photographs later that day, how the light fell through the patched windows, how the hill bloomed behind her cabin, she was startled. It was the first time she'd seen her work through someone else's eyes. A month later, those photographs appeared in a small exhibit at the community center in Somerset. The project was called Still Standing: Resilience in Rural America. Rhoda's cabin was one of 12 stories featured, but it drew the largest crowd. People came from Wayne, Pulaski, and McCreary counties, farmers, teachers, retired miners, young families, to see what she'd done. The room filled with quiet murmurs as they studied the images. The floor made of mismatched tiles, the garden built on stone, the walls insulated with denim. Some visitors wiped their eyes. Others just nodded in recognition. What moved them wasn't the beauty of the cabin itself, but what it symbolized: proof that you could still survive, still create something lasting with almost nothing. It reminded them of the values that once defined their parents and grandparents: resourcefulness, patience, and pride in making do. One woman whispered, "This feels like how life used to be before everything got so expensive." For a community that had long been told it was dying, Rhoda's story was like a pulse returning. Word spread faster after that. Within weeks, strangers began showing up on Rhoda's dirt driveway. One was a single mother from near Wolf Creek Marina, recently evicted and living in a borrowed camper. Another was a disabled veteran from near General Burnside State Park, who couldn't afford rising utility bills. A widower from the Tennessee border came seeking advice after medical debt swallowed his savings. Each arrived unsure of what they were looking for. Some came for ideas, others simply for hope. Rhoda didn't turn anyone away. She wasn't an expert or a teacher, just someone who'd learned through failure. She showed them the simple systems she'd built, how her rain barrels caught and filtered water from the roof, how the compost toilet kept waste manageable, how the pulleys lifted supplies up the hill. She explained how she'd found materials cheap or free: old doors from Habitat Restore, jeans for insulation, flooring scraps saved from the landfill. "You don't have to fix everything at once," she told them. "You just start with one corner." One afternoon, the single mother returned with her teenage son. Together, they studied the mosaic floor Rhoda had pieced together from discarded samples. "It's like a puzzle," the boy said. Rhoda smiled. "Exactly. Every scrap has its place." That day, they left with a trunk full of reclaimed tiles and a promise to build their own floor, one square at a time. Soon, small groups began gathering on weekends: neighbors, curious visitors, and sometimes even local officials who wanted to understand how she'd done it. Rhoda led them through the terraces, showing how each level caught sunlight and drained runoff naturally. She talked about the seeds that had been gifted to her and how she saved them each season. It wasn't a lecture. It was storytelling through action, hands in the dirt, explaining as she worked. What people took away wasn't just technique. It was permission to believe that their lives weren't beyond repair. Many of them had been told their situations were hopeless, that poverty was permanent, that opportunity had passed their towns by. Yet here was a woman who'd been written off, standing in front of a thriving garden built on rock and stubbornness. A man from Somerset who'd lost his job at a factory told her quietly, "You made me realize I still have something left to work with." A woman from Monticello started a small exchange group after visiting, where neighbors shared tools and garden produce. Rhoda's homestead had become more than a story. It was a living classroom for survival. By winter, she'd hosted more visitors than she could count. Some stayed for an hour, some for days. They came for knowledge but left with something deeper: the sense that they still had control over their own lives. Rhoda never claimed to have changed the world, but she had changed how people saw their place in it. For the first time in a long while, the mountains felt alive again with possibility. By the following spring, Rhoda's cabin had become more than a local curiosity. It was a quiet movement taking shape in the Appalachian foothills. Visitors now came from well beyond the surrounding counties. The gravel path that once only saw her old pickup now carried unfamiliar vehicles with out-of-state plates. People arrived not to gawk but to learn, to listen, and to carry a piece of what she'd built back to their own corners of the country. One morning, a journalist from Louisville showed up with a notebook and a small camera. She was writing a series on economic resilience in rural Kentucky and had heard about Rhoda through the Somerset exhibit. She expected to find another human interest piece, a story of hardship dressed up as inspiration. Instead, she found a woman quietly living proof that survival and dignity could coexist. Rhoda walked her through every detail of the property, the mosaic floor, the solar panels, the terrace gardens, and explained how she'd rebuilt not with money, but with persistence and community. "You don't wait for a rescue," she said. "You use what's left and make it enough." When the article was published a few weeks later, it traveled further than anyone expected. The headline read, "The $200 Cabin That Changed a County." Within days, Rhoda's mailbox overflowed with letters, people from across Kentucky and beyond thanking her for reminding them what was still possible. A man from Michigan wrote that he'd lost his manufacturing job and was living in his car, but her story made him start saving for a small plot of land. A retired couple from Maine sent a photograph of their garden terrace inspired by hers. Soon after, a group of environmental science students from Eastern Kentucky University arrived. They wanted to study her systems, how she captured rainwater, used shredded denim insulation, and kept energy costs near zero. Rhoda laughed when they asked about her process. "I didn't follow any plan," she told them. "Just a lot of trial and error." The students spent 2 days collecting data and taking notes, fascinated that her home functioned as a low-tech model of sustainability. One professor later described it as a working classroom in the hills. A few weeks later, a documentary filmmaker from Lexington contacted her. He was creating a film about post-industrial Appalachia, about what happens when an economy built on extraction leaves communities behind. Rhoda hesitated at first. She didn't want cameras in her face or her life turned into a spectacle. But he promised to capture things as they were, no dramatization, no pity. "I just want people to see what rebuilding really looks like," he told her. For a week, he followed Rhoda through her daily routines, feeding chickens, tending to her garden, fixing the wood stove, welcoming visitors who stopped by for advice. The film crew slept in tents nearby, eating meals she cooked on her small hot plate. What struck them most wasn't her ingenuity but her calm. She wasn't angry about the past or nostalgic for what she'd lost. She was busy building something new out of what was left. "You can't wait for the world to turn fair," she said at one point during filming. "You just get to work." Months later, the short film premiered at the Kentucky Theater in Lexington. The audience included students, city officials, and working-class families from across the state. The room was silent as Rhoda's voice filled the screen, talking about rebuilding after loss. When the lights came up, people were wiping their eyes. The tears weren't from sadness, they were from recognition. Her story echoed across regions that had suffered the same fate: factory towns in Ohio, farming communities in Kansas, mill villages in Massachusetts. People who'd been told their best days were over suddenly saw proof that survival could look different, and still be good. The film went on to screen at several festivals focused on American poverty and resilience. Journalists called it a story that redefined success. But for Rhoda, the real change was happening back home. Churches started organizing materials exchanges, places where families could trade tools, lumber, and clothing without money. Habitat Restore in London began seeing new faces. People who'd once felt embarrassed to buy second-hand now walked through proudly, inspired by her example. "It's not about what's new," one shopper said. "It's about what still works." Across Wayne and Pulaski counties, young people who once dreamed only of leaving started thinking differently. They talked about small farming, renewable energy, and sustainable housing, ways to stay rooted without being trapped. A high school teacher from Monticello used Rhoda's story in her civics class, calling it a modern example of American self-reliance. For the first time in years, the word hope didn't sound like wishful thinking. Meanwhile, Rhoda's informal trading network continued to grow. A man who repaired engines began offering help in exchange for produce. A retired carpenter taught her how to reinforce her porch beams. Local women started gathering once a week to exchange homemade goods, jars of jam, soap, and candles, for things they needed. It wasn't charity. It was cooperation, revived and reshaped for their time. The community around Rhoda's cabin had changed. It was no longer about survival alone. It was about rediscovery. People remembered old crafts, shared forgotten knowledge, and built new systems from the ground up. What began as one woman's attempt to stay alive had become a quiet revolution in how people viewed worth, work, and one another. By late summer, Rhoda would sometimes sit on her porch at dusk, watching the faint glow of other cabins flicker through the trees. She knew many of those lights were powered by repurposed panels, wired by hands that had visited her home. The sound of distant laughter and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the valley. The mountains, once marked by silence and loss, were alive again, this time with connection. 2 years after buying the condemned cabin, Rhoda's home stood quietly at the top of the hillside, a modest 320 square feet that looked both humble and complete. It wasn't fancy or new, but it was steady. The roof no longer leaked, the wall stayed warm in winter, and the small wood stove burned through the coldest nights. Her days still began before sunrise and ended long after dark. She hauled water, split firewood, and tended to her terrace garden. Life was still hard, but it was hers, and that made all the difference. What had grown around her cabin mattered even more than the structure itself. The people who once pitied her now sought her advice. The community that had nearly given up on itself was learning again that worth came not from possessions but from what one could create, repair, and share. Rhoda had started with nothing more than desperation, yet somehow built something priceless, a living example that capability and dignity didn't depend on money. They depended on courage, patience, and the will to begin again. Over time, 5 lessons began to stand out from her story, ideas that reached far beyond her small corner of Kentucky and resonated across the country. The first was resourcefulness as dignity. In a culture where buying things had become the main proof of success, Rhoda's approach turned that logic inside out. She found beauty in what others threw away and purpose in learning skills most had forgotten. Every nail she reused, every patch she fixed, every seed she planted restored more than just her home, it restored her sense of worth. "If I can make it work," she told one visitor, "it's mine twice over, once for having it, and once for understanding it." The second was community as economy. When money grew scarce, cooperation became currency. What Rhoda built wasn't an isolated project. It was the return of neighbor-to-neighbor alliance that had sustained Appalachia long before modern jobs existed. People traded work, food, and knowledge the way earlier generations once traded grain and lumber. Barn raisings became tool-sharing weekends. A quilting group turned into a supply exchange. They didn't call it a movement, but that's what it became. An economy rooted in trust instead of profit. The third was seeing value in the discarded. Rhoda had rebuilt her home with materials salvaged from places others had forgotten: barns, dumps, and scrapyards. That same mindset extended to people. The unemployed, the elderly, the disabled, those written off by a system that measured human worth in productivity, were finding new roles through shared purpose. A retired mechanic taught teenagers to repair engines. A widow who once felt useless began baking bread for trade. "We're all fixable," Rhoda often said, "even if the world says we're too far gone." The fourth was small as sustainable. Rhoda's cabin stood as quiet proof that comfort didn't require size or abundance. Her 320 square feet held everything she needed: shelter, warmth, food, and peace. She no longer measured success in square footage or brand names, but in freedom from debt and the closeness of her community. Visitors who came expecting pity often left with envy. "You've got less," one man told her, But somehow, you've got more. The fifth and final lesson was documentation as multiplication. Rhoda hadn't intended to teach anyone. But through the photos, articles, and the short documentary, her story became a guide for others facing hardship. Across Appalachia, and far beyond, families began adopting her methods. Some built small off-grid homes, others started garden cooperatives or clothing exchanges. A veterans group in Ohio used her denim insulation idea for a community housing project. A single mother in Alabama wrote that she'd started collecting scrap wood to build raised garden beds after seeing Rhoda's mosaic floor online. Every retelling multiplied the impact. By the end of that second year, Rhoda understood something she hadn't when she first bought the cabin. She hadn't fixed poverty or reversed the forces that had hollowed out her hometown. Those problems were larger than one person could carry. But she had proven that hopelessness wasn't the only response. When systems failed, individuals could still choose to create meaning, to rebuild piece by piece. Her story wasn't about defying the odds. It was about refusing to surrender to them. Sometimes, when visitors came from far away, people who had read about her or seen the film, they expected her to have all the answers. She would smile and say softly, "I don't have answers. I just stopped waiting to be rescued." That humility struck everyone who met her. It reminded them that transformation didn't begin with programs or policies. It began with one choice, repeated daily, to keep going despite everything. On summer evenings, as the light faded across the Kentucky mountains, Rhoda often sat on her porch watching the valley below. She could see the glow of other cabins, small homes built by those she'd once taught. The air carried the sound of laughter and the faint clink of tools being put away for the night. What began as her personal struggle had become a shared story of recovery, quietly spreading from one hollow to another. She didn't need recognition to know its worth. Each time someone stopped by to trade vegetables, or asked her advice about rainwater collection, she saw the proof. What started as survival had grown into something far deeper, a community that remembered who it was, and what it could still be. The cabin stands quietly now, weathered wood, moss-softened roof lines, and terrace gardens that hug the hillside like they've always belonged there. 2 decades have passed since Rhoda handed over her last $200 for what everyone swore was a waste of land and lumber. Yet here she is at 60, still planting, still sharing, still bartering tomatoes for eggs with the same neighbors who once thought she'd freeze before her first winter. She never became rich or famous. Her name doesn't appear in any national headlines. But in her corner of Kentucky, Rhoda's small home has become something deeper, a living example that comfort and dignity can be reclaimed when people stop measuring worth by what they can buy and start valuing what they can build. Visitors still come. Some want to see the miracle cabin. Others come for advice, students, community organizers, families starting over. They walk the terrace garden, study her denim-insulated walls, and listen to her talk about the early years when every nail, every plank, every vegetable seed felt like an act of faith. She always laughs when they ask what kept her going. "What choice did I have?" she says. "When you've got nothing left to lose, you finally learn what you can do." What made people cry in the end wasn't the cabin's beauty or its storybook charm. It was what it represented. It reminded them that resilience isn't rare. It's buried under exhaustion and doubt, waiting for necessity to bring it out. Rhoda's journey stripped survival back to its essence: food, warmth, purpose, and connection. That moment, handing over $200 for a shack the world called useless, became her defining decision. "Everyone saw rot," she once said, "but I saw a chance. Not because I was brave or visionary, but because I was cornered." Sometimes being cornered is what saves you. It forces you to remember what you're made of. Her story echoed far beyond her mountain ridge. Across small towns in Ohio, Tennessee, and Maine, people who'd given up on home ownership began building with reclaimed wood, starting community gardens, or reviving trade networks. Churches formed repair circles. Schools began teaching sustainable design with her cabin as a case study. Without setting out to, Rhoda helped ignite a quiet movement, proof that the American spirit of self-reliance and cooperation hadn't died, only been forgotten. Today, the cabin still hums with life. Chickens scratch between rows of kale and beans. A wood stove clicks and settles as evening chill creeps in. From her porch, Rhoda looks out over the valley, watching a neighbor approach with a carton of eggs. She smiles, already setting aside a basket of tomatoes in return. The same informal economy she started years ago continues, an exchange of effort and care that keeps everyone just a little more secure. What she built wasn't just a home, it was a blueprint. A living, breathing reminder that being discarded by the economy doesn't mean being without value. Her tiny cabin proved that capability, creativity, and compassion can build more lasting wealth than money ever could. As Rhoda often says to visitors before they leave, you don't need much to start, just enough courage to take the first hard step. Her story remains a challenge and an invitation. If you lost everything tomorrow, what could you build with your own hands? If her journey moved you, share this story with someone who needs to remember their own strength. And let's keep proving, one act of resilience at a time, that community and capability are still America's greatest riches. The cabin stands quietly on the Kentucky hillside, its wood faded by rain and sun, its garden terraces bursting with life. Years have passed since Rhoda handed over her last $200 for what everyone called a useless shack. Now, at 60, she still tends her vegetables, still welcomes visitors, and still trades tomatoes for eggs with neighbors who once pitied her. She never became rich or famous. She didn't build a dream mansion or retire in comfort. But she built something much rarer, a life that worked. Every board and seed in that cabin became proof that dignity isn't something money gives, it's something effort creates. People come from miles away to see it. Students, reporters, families trying to start over. They walk through her small home and see how denim scraps became insulation, how reclaimed windows catch the morning light, how a hillside that once looked useless now feeds half the valley. When they ask what kept her going, Rhoda always says, "I didn't have courage. I just didn't have a choice." Somehow, that honesty moves them more than any polished success story ever could. What made people cry when they saw her finished cabin wasn't its beauty. It was the reminder that capability lives inside all of us, waiting for the moment we stop doubting it. Her journey wasn't about beating the odds. It was about showing what happens when someone refuses to give up. When Rhoda looks back on the day she spent her last $200, she still remembers the fear. "Everyone saw junk," she says, "but I saw a chance. Not because I was brave, because I was desperate." Sometimes that's what it takes to remember what you're made of. Her story spread quietly but powerfully. From Appalachia to small towns across the Midwest, people began reclaiming abandoned spaces, trading skills, and sharing what they had. Churches started tool exchanges. Communities built gardens together. Rhoda's cabin had become more than a home. It had become a model of survival, a reminder that value doesn't come from the market, but from the human hands that create and rebuild. On summer evenings, she still sits on her porch, watching the sun settle over the hills. The air smells of soil and wood smoke. A neighbor walks up the path with a basket of eggs. She smiles, holding out a few ripe tomatoes in return. The quiet rhythm of trade and trust continues, proof that the best kind of wealth is shared. Rhoda's story reminds us that our worth isn't measured by what we can buy, but by what we can build, create, and share with others. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We're bringing you another powerful American story tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what lesson from Rhoda's journey resonated most with you. Your support helps us keep sharing these important stories. Until next time, remember, you're more capable than you know.